features and improvements. There's in all versions, there are improvements to the software. Sometimes it's not even noticeable, and sometimes it's quite dramatic, you know, that the speed of the software sometimes makes a dramatic jump forward. So here's a rough overview. We're going to talk about the general improvements, then modeling, texturing, rigging, and animation. Scene evaluation is also something here. Lighting and rendering, I will leave that more to John-Paul Giancarlo, who will show the news and improvements in Arnold. And also, I'm not going to talk about Bifrost too much. So the general improvements, Arnold 6, finally, is the release of the GPU renderer. John will tell you, or John-Paul will tell you everything about it. Bifrost procedural, or the version 2, the next generation of Bifrost, will be shown by John Capleton, my colleague from the UK. And the other stuff in Maya, so the outliner performance, that's one of those things you don't notice much improvement there. You will, you can read in special cases, you will definitely experience some performances, but it's a rather special thing. Also in the UV editor, sometimes, you know, some people who work extensively in the UV editor will certainly feel an performance improvement. Audio management in the timeline. So that's what you see, these little animations here on the screen are about the timeline and the new audio features in the timeline that let you do things like mute clips, import, delete clips, and stuff like that. That's the importance here. As I said, Arnold 6 will be shown by John-Paul Giancarlo. The GPU rendering is the most impressive thing, but also, you know, USD components are certainly very interesting to most of you. There are, of course, some things inside Maya concerning the lighting and rendering. So light editor improvements, for example, or render setup improvements are things worth to mention here. More details are in the what's new and the release notes, of course. So I'm not going to dive too deep into this one here. And Bifrost, as I said, the Bifrost extension presentation will be done by John Capleton. So let's jump onto modeling. That's the first very interesting thing where I can also show something. You know, the visual improvements and new features are, of course, the ones that we always jump on to show. Here's a new feature that you can click on and something new that you can use. You see in these animations, it has something to do with the modeling and topology in Maya. So here's a little animation that I recorded that shows how you can use remeshing, or the function remesh and retopologize with your geometry. So this geometry here was done with some Boolean operations, and you see, well, the geometry is not that bad, but we have some bad polygons here, you know, concave polygons with multiple edges instead of just 4 edges. And the remesh function is something that cuts your geometry into in smaller triangles, and maybe even very small triangles for deformation, a very interesting thing. But you can also use it as a base to start a retopologize. And retopologize tries to make a regular mesh out of it. So this one here has melted also the hard borders. So of course, we want to keep these hard edges. So I click on preserve hard edges. And you see, that's a pretty good topology. I can decrease the anisotropy, which would make the whole mesh much more regular and calmer, and also reduce the number of faces here. So with 500 faces, this polygon object is really a nice look, and I can decrease it further. There are edges that can be deleted, but this is already a very good topology. Here's another example. I used this insect from the Maya modeling or Maya model library and made a very high density mesh out of it. So with retopologize, you get a super clean model out of that. So imagine you had a scanned object and you want to make something like this topology. And when I increase the number of polygons, it gets even better. It gets nicer geometry. And this is a one-click solution. So you don't have to do anything about it. You don't have to, you know, make it by hand. You just choose the function, and that's it. So these two functions here, remesh and retopologize, that's certainly worth looking at next time when you start Maya 2020. In texturing, there was a lot of improvements with the Substance plugin, so you can batch import and also batch bake the textures to disk, so you don't have to sit there and click all of the textures manually. It would do that all automatically. And in other stuff in there, I don't want to read the whole slide to you, just make you aware that there's something there if you are using Substance a lot. In rigging, there are some improvements, basically deformer improvements that are very interesting. So the two lower videos that you see here are the proximity wrap deformer, and we also have some interesting constraints, new constraints. So let me show you in this video here. So with this head here, I first want to use the head as an object that carries a rivet, for example. Or, you know, we can use the proximity pin here that I'm pointing at to pin something to the head. Let's say a simple cone object here. I select the target and the object itself and choose proximity pin. And then you notice that there's a little locator in this object. And this locator is used to position the object against the surface. And then I can deform the surface, for example, with soft selection here. And you see that the pin or the cone is pinned to the surface and keeps its relative position and is not deformed together with the surface, but keeps its relative position. You see the locator is still there, it may remain still, and with the locator you can adjust the position of that cone. So let's remove that, and now let's go and deform the face of this model, or this face model here, with another object. So this sphere, for example, it could be a very low resolution face, for example. I'm going to use this sphere to deform the face. So first I will attach a shader that I make transparent, so that we can see through. And then the workflow is a little bit different from other deformers. So I select the object that I want to deform and simply create this proximity wrap deformer. Now notice in the attribute editor, you get a new edit node window button. And in this window, you can see the geometry that is being deformed and the deformers. So there's no driver selected now. Let's add something. Oops, that breaks something. So you have to make sure that you freeze transforms all of the objects that you want to use as a deformer. So now I can add it. And now I can pick a face, for example, on that sphere. Let's take this one here and move it around, and you see that it deforms my object. It's not very nice yet. Make sure that you, in the proximity wrap node, that you increase the smoothing. That makes the deformation much better, much smoother. Now that's the typical moment when you've done all the deformations, when you see, actually to this face, I have some eyebrows that belong to it. So I would have to undo everything to get these objects also deformed with my wrap deformer. But in this new window here, you can add geometry after you've done everything. So look at the eyebrows now. When I add them, they get deformed instantly. So now they are part of the deformed object. And when I, move the face again, you see they are deformed with the other. And the same way you can add more deformation objects, etc. So that's a very cool thing, a very cool new workflow with these proximity wrap deformers. And this one here is an interesting one for rigging. Many of you riggers are using matrices already to drive objects instead of the constraint objects. And this video is about how to use these new constraints or these new connections. So I have an object here that is not connected to the blue sphere, and this one is also not connected to the blue sphere. Let's say those are tools that are supposed to bring the blue sphere in, like so. This one is bringing the blue sphere in, and the other one is supposed to pick the blue sphere up and move it away. Okay, so the first part of it is pretty simple. I take the object and parent it to the first object. Yeah, right. Okay, that's at least the way it would work. You see that now the sphere moves with the first object is moved in. And the second step might be I take the second object as a target and create a parent constraint with offset, right? So at least the second part of the animation works nice. The parent constraint takes the sphere away. So we have achieved what we wanted. But you know, this one, the parent constraint works, but the parenting itself is not working anymore. So that's overridden. And we will have to do something about it now, animate the weights of the parent constraint and stuff like that. So when we look at the parent constraint here in the node editor, you see that there's a lot of connections between the nodes that are, you know, the targets and the actual constraint objects. And this one can be done much easier. So I'm deleting that constraint and do the new matrix connection or the offset parent matrix connection. So this object here, or you see the parenting is still working. I take these two objects here, open the node editor. These are the two objects, and I want to now connect the matrix, and the matrix contains all the translation, rotation, scale, and shear values, and I want to connect it to a new plug called offset parent matrix. That's this one here. That's it. So this one connection does all the things that a parent constraint would do and more. Even you see they are now connected. The parenting still works. That's the funny thing. And the object has still open transformation values so that I can still keyframe the object itself, which is no longer possible when you do a constraint. So now my animation fully works. It picks it up and moves it away. Wait a second. It picks it up. How does it pick it up? So look at the object. Here is a parent object. So the movement of the parent object is not you know, transferred over to the workpiece, but only the movement of the tool itself. So that's an interesting new way of connecting things, and it's much, much faster than you know, all these constraint objects, and it doesn't, you know, block things like block your transformation values and you can't keyframe anymore. So that's a very cool thing for rigging. Also for rigging or for the whole animation part, the evaluation toolkit now has a proper profiling documentation. So when you look in the profiler, so all of these images here are screenshots of the profiler, you don't no longer have to guess what all of these parts and pieces are. It's now properly documented so that you can learn how to use this analysis tool to find out why your scene is doing what it does. Same thing with the scene lint window. It's now properly documented what it does and how to use it. In animation, you see here in these little movies that we have on the very left side, we have a scalable timeline. So you just grab it and move this bar up so you have a timeline as big as you want it. In the middle, you see the new timeline bookmarks. So in the timeline, you can bookmark sections. For instance, the animation that you want to work on, that time, you can bookmark it. And on the right side, you see the bookmark editor or the bookmark manager, where you can say, I want to see this bookmark, I want to create a new one. I want to jump to a bookmark, or I want to unbookmark, which means I want to jump back to the full timeline and see my whole animation as a to see my animation in context, right? And the same applies to the graph editor. So there were a lot of little things to make better, especially to mention color themes, because we have a lot of users who have problems to see these colors in the graph editor with the dark background and, you know, bluish, greenish, reddish colors. Some people could not see or could not tell which curve is what. And now you have compatible color schemes for colorblind people. And every one of us is a little bit colorblind in a certain space. So this is nothing to laugh about. It helps us to make, you know, really clear which curve is what. So there's a lot of things done here in the graph editor to make it visually a little bit better. So we're going to skip these two animations here. This is an interesting one, an interesting slide. The caching the animation caching that we introduced in Maya 2019 already now works with animated image planes, where people would say, "Oh, come on, what's the big deal about it?" Well, the animated image plane, it was a problem because it has to be converted to a movie at a certain quality and also stored somewhere in memory so that you can still tumble your scene and see the whole animation at full speed. It's not just a play blast. It is really, it has to grab these images and, and compile a video out of that. So that was a bit complicated. Another thing is, and we can see that over here, there is a new feature of playback caching for dynamics. When you use that, when you do that, you will notice a yellow line here in the timeline and an error message. The problem with that is that the playback cache for dynamics is turned off by default. So when you go into the cache preferences, you will see that cache dynamics is off by default. So you have to turn that on, and then suddenly you see a red line in the timeline, and the playback caching is on. And it's a very cool thing. So you can change the properties of something, for example, this sheet here, and it will automatically recache the timeline. When you introduce new collision objects, for example, or when you move them, you see that it instantly recaches the timeline. See the red line appear, and you can scrub it immediately and see what's going on there. And even when you move it, boom, it recaches the timeline so that you can instantly scrub. And the whole process of adjusting an animation is much easier to do. So the last part of my presentation is now the animation part, where we talk about the new motion library from Rococo. You may have heard about it, and I have Maya open in the background here somewhere. And the motion library is this one here. So you see in Maya, there's a new window with a lot of tiles with animations. And when you hover over these tiles, let me go here, for example, you can even tumble these tiles. You can twist them around and look at the animation. These tiles can be imported immediately. And unfortunately, and many people are very frustrated about it, there's a price tag on these tiles. So this one here, for example, costs you $3, $3 US. This one here is $3 US. Here's one for $6 US from various vendors. So the vendor is also here in the tile. And people say, "Oh, come on, that's not a new feature. You just open up Maya for another vendor and we have to pay extra." But let me show you some things. So first of all, you can sort these animations by price. And there's a lot of animations in there. So the first around 100 animations are free, are $0. So you have 100 animations to play around with. So this one here, for example, this front flip is something that I downloaded already. You can put the animations in your basket or cart, as it's called here, and then later purchase it or check out and buy that stuff and download it. You see, I've downloaded it here already. So when I click on this button now, you will see here in the outliner, you will see how it downloads that thing. It's only 2 more minutes left. And now we have this reference. Let me close it now. Now we have this reference skeleton in here in my scene, and there's the animation in here. And the animation caching has already kicked in. You see the blue line on the bar, and it's already animated. This is now, and I have to turn on the playback range as well. This is now 120 frames. So it has automatically adjusted the frame rate. I can now go to my character and say, second, in the Human IK panel with my character that I used for one-click rigging, hey, you quick rig character, you are no longer controlled by the control rig. I want you to follow this character here, or this, this loaded character. And now when I click on play, you see now my fully skinned character does the same thing. The funny thing with Human IK is, and let me scrub back a little bit so you can better see it, that the reference object has an offset from my actual object. That is because my actual object is a little bit taller. the legs are a little bit longer, and to keep the pose of this animation, it has to make this offset. I can of course tell the whole thing, hey, you want to follow this hand really one by one and want to match that position for the hand and the feet if you really want to, but you don't have to. So what we can now do is to say, I want, instead of 120 frames, I just want to make a 30 frame animation. And then, the whole thing works in 30 frames. It downsamples that automatically. And then I can tell my character, hey, I want to bake this animation onto my control rig. And then it goes through these 107 frames and bakes each one of them, or bakes the position of my control rig handles to have its own animation. And that's done now. So all of my handles here now have a keyframe for every frame. And I can actually delete this reference object. Let's remove it. I delete it altogether. My character now has an animation. And I can even go in and modify this animation with the time editor, for example. So for example, we see here something where the hand dives into the body. So I would have to open the time editor, make a new layer and move the hand out of the body so that I, with the human IK rig, that's really simple to do these little corrections, right? So that's the very interesting stuff that we added here. And to be honest, how long do you want to search the internet for a free animation instead of just grabbing that stuff for $3? It's much, much easier to have that inside Maya, and you don't have to download it somewhere to your hard drive. You can load it directly into Maya and use it right away. And for that, $6 or $3 is nothing. It saves your day and makes it much easier. So with that, I'm done with my presentation. So I stop the sharing, and I'll pass it over to the next person in the row.